On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. It took 48 hours. Saddam Hussein's army rolled through the border, seized the capital, and installed a puppet government before most of the world had finished reading the morning news. Kuwait's military had roughly 16,000 men. Iraq had one of the largest armies on earth. The math was not close. The emir fled. The oil fields fell. And a country that had existed for decades vanished from the map in less than 2 days. Let that sit for a moment. A sovereign nation, a UN member, a major oil producer, simply erased. Not weakened, not occupied in some ambiguous sense. Gone. And the question the world suddenly had to answer was whether anyone was going to do anything about it. The actual history of the Gulf War contradicts the prevailing narrative. You've been told it was inevitable, that America's overwhelming power made the outcome obvious from the start. That's wrong. What happened between August 1990 and February 1991 was one of the most complex diplomatic and military operations in modern history. 42 countries, one coalition, one deadline, and a ground war that lasted exactly 100 hours. To understand what America actually did, you need to understand what Saddam Hussein thought he was doing. Iraq had just finished 8 years of war against Iran. The country was $37 billion in debt, much of it owed to Kuwait and the UAE. Saddam had spent years arguing that Iraq's war against Iran was a service to the entire Gulf, that the loans weren't loans, that they were payments. Kuwait disagreed. Kuwait was also, according to Baghdad, drilling diagonally into Iraqi oil fields through a technique called slant drilling, pulling Iraqi oil from the Rumaila reservoir without permission. Saddam wanted the debt canceled. He wanted the drilling stopped. He wanted more money. Kuwait refused. So he took the country instead. Within hours of the invasion, the United States and Kuwait brought the crisis to the UN Security Council. Resolution 660 passed the same day. It condemned the invasion and demanded immediate withdrawal. Iraq ignored it. President George H.W. Bush stood in front of cameras on August 5th and said something that would define the next 6 months. "This will not stand," he said. "This aggression against Kuwait." Those 7 words committed the United States to one of the most ambitious military operations since World War II. Saudi Arabia agreed to host U.S. troops. The coalition started forming. NATO allies, Arab states, the Soviet Union, countries that had spent 4 decades on opposite sides of the Cold War suddenly aligned on the same resolution. By August, 40 nations had committed. The mission had a name, Operation Desert Shield. What Desert Shield actually required was almost beyond comprehension. The U.S. military had to move an entire fighting force, not just soldiers, but tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, food, medical equipment, communications infrastructure, across an ocean and into a desert. By mid-November, the United States had over 240,000 troops in theater. The UK had sent more than 25,000. Egypt contributed 20,000. France, 5,500. Dozens of other countries sent what they could. By January 15th, coalition forces numbered close to 1 million personnel. That is the largest overseas military deployment America had executed since the Second World War. The logistics alone took months. Fast sea-lift ships moved equipment around the clock. The buildup ultimately reached 543,000 troops, more than twice the number used. In the 2003 invasion of Iraq, 13 years later, the UN gave Iraq a deadline. Resolution 678 authorized force and set January 15, 1991, as the final date for Iraqi withdrawal. Saddam did not move. The coalition did. On the night of January 16th, the air campaign began. Over 1,000 sorties launched on the first day alone. The opening strike was carried out by 9 Apache helicopters from the 101st Aviation Regiment, flying low and fast in the dark, launching 27 Hellfire missiles at Iraqi radar installations. In minutes, they tore a 20-mile gap in Iraq's air defense network. Then the bombers came through. The air campaign that followed was the largest sustained aerial bombardment since World War II. Coalition aircraft targeted radar systems, command posts, communications nodes, weapons facilities, bridges, and roads. The F-117. Nighthawk stealth aircraft flew missions over Baghdad that the Iraqis couldn't track or intercept. Precision-guided munitions, what the press called smart bombs, hit targets with an accuracy that previous generations of military planners couldn't have imagined. By January 28th, the coalition had achieved full air supremacy. Iraq's air force was effectively neutralized. Its air defense network was in ruins. Its ground forces, dug into Kuwait, were being hit continuously from above with no ability to respond. The air campaign ran for 38 days. What it did to Iraqi ground forces is important to understand. These weren't just airstrikes on military infrastructure. Coalition aircraft were systematically degrading the Iraqi army's ability to fight. Its supply lines cut, its command structure dismantled, its armor destroyed piecemeal before a single coalition soldier crossed the border. Iraqi troops in Kuwait were conscripts, many of them exhausted from the Iran-Iraq War, poorly supplied, cut off from reinforcement, and under constant bombardment. Desertion rates climbed, morale collapsed. Intelligence reports described Iraqi soldiers waving white flags at reconnaissance aircraft. They weren't fighting a war anymore. They were surviving one, and then came the ground war. February 24, 1991, 4 a.m. The U.S. 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions crossed into Kuwait. They moved through minefields and wire obstacles and trench systems in the dark. They expected resistance. What they mostly found were soldiers trying to surrender. Iraqi units collapsed almost immediately. Light tank battles broke out. Some positions fought back. But the scale of the capitulation was stunning. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers surrendered in the first hours. Then thousands. The Marines moved toward Kuwait City faster than the plan anticipated. Here is where the operation's real brilliance becomes visible. General Norman Schwarzkopf had spent months planning a maneuver that Iraq never saw coming. The Iraqi military expected a frontal assault from the south and an amphibious landing on the coast. Schwarzkopf let them believe it. Coalition forces ran amphibious exercises in the Gulf, deployed naval assets near the Kuwaiti coastline, and kept Iraqi attention fixed on the front door. Meanwhile, he moved the bulk of his armored force far to the west, into the desert, past the edge of Iraqi defensive lines. The 18th Airborne Corps executed what became known as the left hook, a massive sweeping arc through open desert, curving around and behind the entire Iraqi position in Kuwait. Elements of the 101st and 82nd Airborne were 24 miles the Invades, roamed the Euphrates River by mid-afternoon on the first day. The Republican Guard, Iraq's best troops, suddenly found coalition armor closing from a direction they hadn't defended. Iraqi forces didn't just retreat, they collapsed. Units that hadn't been destroyed from the air disintegrated under the speed and weight of the armored advance. The route north out of Kuwait City, the highway back to Basra, became a scene of total military catastrophe. Retreating Iraqi soldiers were caught in the open by coalition aircraft. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed in what journalists would call the highway of death. Saddam's army, the fourth largest in the world at the start of the conflict, was being systematically dismantled. Over 3,000 Iraqi tanks were captured or destroyed during air and ground operations combined. More than 1,400 armored personnel carriers, more than 2,200 artillery pieces. 41 Iraqi divisions effectively ceased to exist as fighting forces. The coalition declared a ceasefire on February 28, 1991. 100 hours after the ground war began, coalition combat deaths totaled 392 across all nations combined. The United States lost 96 soldiers killed in action. Iraqi battle deaths are estimated between 20,000 and 35,000. Kuwait was liberated. The emir returned on March 15th after spending more than 8 months in exile. U.S. Army units immediately began distributing food, water, and medical care. Engineers started work on infrastructure. The oil fields were another matter entirely. Retreating Iraqi forces had set nearly 700 Kuwaiti oil wells on fire as they fled, a deliberate scorched earth strategy that created black columns of smoke visible from space and an environmental catastrophe that took 10 months to extinguish. What America and its coalition built in 6 months was something the world hadn't seen before. A military alliance spanning NATO and the Arab world, the West, and the former Soviet bloc, assembled under a UN mandate, equipped with satellite navigation used in large-scale land combat for the first time, coordinated through digital communications networks that allowed commanders to track operations across an entire theater in real time. Desert Storm wasn't just a war, it was a demonstration. GPS, stealth aircraft, precision munitions, satellite communications handling 80% of theater traffic, all of it tested simultaneously against a real enemy at scale. The Iraqi army never understood what was hitting it, or from where. By the time the ceasefire came, Kuwait existed again as a country, and the force that had erased it in 48 hours had been broken in 100.